Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bios and Bookmarks, Season 5, Episode 2. I'm Shara McCallum, and I'm delighted to be here today with one of my favorite writers. I can say that with completely no bias and no hesitation, poet Shara McCallum. Shara, welcome to Bios and Bookmarks.
Thank you, Shivani. And I don't say this to sound also like I'm just being hyperbolic, but the same goes for you, as you know.
Oh, thank you so much. So Shara is here with us to read from and discuss her sixth collection of poems, No Ruined Stone, published by Peepal Tree Press in the UK and Alice James Books in the US. Shara is from Jamaica, born to a Jamaican father and Venezuelan mother. She's the author, like I just said, of 6 books published in the US and UK, most recently this one, No Ruined Stone. Her poems and essays have appeared in journals, anthologies, and textbooks throughout the US, Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and Israel. La historia es un cuarto, History is a Room, an anthology of poems selected from across her 6 books and translated into Spanish by Adalbert Salas Hernandez, himself a very fine poet, was published in 2021 by Mantis Editors in Mexico. Shara was appointed the 2021-2022 Penn State Laureate. No Ruined Stone is an absolutely fascinating book that I think fits the theme of our season, which is telling complex family stories as though it were made for it, though of course it's not. And in it, Shara is doing incredible work, not necessarily of taking one of Scotland's most beloved historical figures to task per se, but imagining what his life might have been like, specifically with resonances for what it would mean for Caribbean history if he took an entirely different path. And Shara, I feel like there's no better way to introduce our audience to the world of No Ruined Stone than to invite you to read from it for us, please.
Thank you, Shivani. And again, I'm just really grateful for your kind attention to this book. I'm going to try to read just for 10 minutes or so and be brief on introductions to the poems because I know that we're going to be having a chat, which I look forward to. I'll say about this first one, it's the title poem for the book. It's the opening and the closing, and I'll read both today. And it directly addresses Robert Burns, who you've talked about, and how this book really came about in a lot of ways. So the you here is Burns I'm addressing, and the I of this poem, which is exceptional in the book. The book is mostly in personae. This is me speaking. No Ruined Stone to Robert Burns after Callum Colvin's portrait of Hugh MacDiarmid. You saturate the sight of those who come after, poets and painters alike. Your words invade my mind's listening, manacle my tongue when I try to speak. On all I backward cast my eye, and fear and cannot see. Who would I have been to you? What stone in the ruined house of the past? In this world, I am unloosed, belonging to no country, no tribe, no clan, not African, not Scotland. And you, voice that stalks my waking and dreaming, you more myth than man, cannot unmake history. So why am I here, resurrecting you to speak, when your silence gulfs centuries? Why do I find myself on your doorstep knocking when I know the dead will never answer? And I'm just going to read one of the poems from the very, very end of Robert Burns' time there. So what the book imagines is what would have happened had he gone to Scotland. And had he gone, he would have been fully imbricated in slavery. He would have ended up working as an overseer on a plantation in Port Antonio, Jamaica. The time period of Burns's section, where he's the principal speaker, 1786 to 1796. And I'm going to read the last poem from his section and then a correlative title in the second section of the book. So you can hear the kind of, hopefully, echoes of history that the book also is trying to construct. This is in Burns' voice now. Springbank is the name of the plantation. It's actually the great house's name on the plantation where he would have gone. Springbank, place of memory, now in ruin. This point overlooking the sea, this cliff, this perch, paradise to none but one who came, imagining he could be Lord, could be unmoored from class and caste. The way past is always the way through. After sea, over land we traversed mountain, rocky passages flanking us, abutted by gullies, oversized plants casting their shadows. The horses' hooves trod and trod until stone gave way to field, and we entered the valley, approaching the great house from behind. That first sight rises still in my mind, bodying forth false promise. Look twice, or you leap once. Echoes, now fruitless. Oh, what foolishness lies in the heart of man, gleaming wish to be more, that waits for its chance to pounce and savage. And the second half of the book is in the voice of a fictive character. So the first half is a fictional Burns, but hewing very closely to the history of his life and his time period and what I came to learn even from my research. The second is in the voice of Isabella, who is his imagined granddaughter, and she has a complex genealogy, which this poem sort of hints at. Burns is her grandfather. He's one of her grandparents. Her grandmother is an enslaved African woman named Nancy, with whom Burns has a multi-year relationship while he's on the plantation. Their daughter is Isabella's mother, and Isabella's father is the owner of the plantation who rapes Isabella's mother. I think that's what you need to know going in terms of characters. Douglas, the name of the master of the plantation, and Isabella's father. Agnes, her mother who dies in childbirth. Nancy, her grandmother who raises her. And when Isabella's section opens, she has migrated in childhood to Scotland with her grandmother and has been passing for white. She is 19 years old and has just married. Her grandmother has just died. And these are her poems and her speaking to often Burns in this section and sometimes to her husband, who does not know she is a Black woman. Springbank. Was all the world I'd known. A child there, I was hers, Miss Nancy's kin. No matter this skin, these eyes belonging to his face. Your father could not look at you without seeing disgrace, was the only answer she'd relent to offer. Even when her life waned, she would not unlock the past. Tell me what she'd said that made him let us go. Why he paid and paid to send us away and away. We left first for Kingston, and a door closed behind us, a door I was never meant to open again. In Kingston, my grandmother was passed off as my slave. By the time our ship docked in Greenock, she was my servant, and we threaded into a tale so tightly woven, no one would guess my origin. What she sacrificed was everything of herself to see me freed. But my father, you kent him and his world so intimately. What I've surmised will be no surprise. What Douglas understood was expedience. I was simply evidence. I needed to be erased. And I think I'll just read one more poem in Isabella's voice. And this is, again, she's mourning her grandmother. And this poem, I think, is a mourning for her grandmother. It is also the history and the memory that Isabella carries of the Middle Passage, among many other migrations. The poem is called Memory. My first was sound, brought forth from her hands, wielding an axe, severing the necks of fowl, rending flesh from bone, that sound, torn from a throat, the cry she made as a child rendered orphan, stolen across an ocean, hungering to feed, ceaselessly to feed. The second was no sound, but fire, kindled of her hands, lighting kitchen walls, dredging blood from the sea's memory, blood tilling soil, blood not even rain that falls and falls without end, not any water we cross, any riverbed stone can absolve. And I think that's 10 minutes, Shivani, so I'm going to stop there so we can talk for a bit.
Thank you so much for that, Shara. It's the world of No Ruined Stone is, of course, not just one place, but many histories, many family lines. I mean, there's literally a family tree at the spine of this collection, and then so many others that branch out from that. In a way, the way that you interrogate the life of Burns is the root and the heart of that tree. And so I have to ask what is probably a basic but really essential question, which is very simply, why Burns? And you do talk about this a bit afterwards in your author's note in No Ruined Stone. But if you could speak a little bit about the compulsion or the fascination towards Burns, who, as you say, is such a beloved, ubiquitous figure in the literary world and beyond it. Why him and why now?
Yeah. So I can give you a very personal answer first to that question, Shivani, and then I'll give you a more writerly one, I suppose. The personal answer is that my last name is McCallum, and I look the way I look. And all my life, people have asked me if I'm Scottish. And my father was a mixed race Black Jamaican, and it's his name that's the one I'm carrying. His father was Black, his mother was British. And so if I am, I've had to explain to people I might not be Scottish in the way that you're imagining. And that, I think, is a history that I've lived with my whole life, that I never thought about Burns as imbricated in. So there lies part of the compulsion, is that I already knew in an abstract way that Scotland is something I carried in a complex way as a Jamaican, right? So I knew that. I went to Scotland to give a reading, and I was asked again this question: what's the McCallum, right? What's your history? And I said, I'm really not sure. I'm not here to find my tartan. I'm a poet. I'm here to give a reading, and I'm actually from Jamaica. And then people said, well, of course. And this was really the striking of this match that you're talking about, Shivani, you must know the story of Burns in Jamaica then. And of course I did not. And that, of course, is what haunted me. Why did I not know that story? I love romantic poetry. I've wrestled since I was a teenager with, once I understood that these men who I kind of worshipped their work would never have seen me. I mean, I don't need to even just talk about romantic poetry. There are loads of contemporary men who I'm very well aware from my interactions with them that I am not seen as the poet that I am meeting them on those grounds. That's not how we're meeting. It's apparent within 5 minutes of the conversation. And so I've wrestled with this, I think, as many people have, but I had no idea that Burns, somebody who I thought of as such a figure of idealism and of equality and egalitarian belief, which he is in his work. He is that. There is some part of Burns that is that. Also was going to go and work on a slave plantation. Also was willing to go and do that. And there are loads of reasons why, and circumstances are what they were for him. They're complicated. But the fact is that abolition was really strong in Scotland in the 18th century. So you really can't make the argument he didn't know. You know, that's not the argument you can make, right? So I guess I'm now verging from the kind of personal to the like intellectual thinking through this as a writer. That was the crux of it for me. I thought, how is it that we continue to live with these heroes and these very static one-dimensional figures who dictate how we understand ourselves, right? They're the whole of the history. It's like a woman like me, who's like Isabella, is not part of that history. It's like she just never existed, even though we do know as Caribbean people, of course she existed. We're not here otherwise. Nancy, of course, existed because I don't exist otherwise, right? So I had to wrestle, I guess, with why Burns by saying, I don't know how he's not part of my history anymore. Once I learned that, I don't know how that's not my kind of ancestral history I have to come to terms with. And the book, the question of the book haunted me. So I didn't ever want to write about this, is what I would say in all honesty. I hewed, as you know, Shivani, much closer to home with family stories. So I love the introduction to the series, right? And then this story was one where I thought, but this is my story and it's not my story, but it's my story, you know? So I guess that's a very, very long-winded answer. You know,
it's
Burns...
a great one. It's, you know, not long-winded, it's complex and braided with the personal and the political and the social in the way that all families are, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm coming to learn from the conversations I'm having in this bios and bookmarks is that there's really no such thing as an uncomplex family. Yes, in the Caribbean, but also outside of it, and the ways in which what we might understand as the nuclear Caribbean family has always had like non-Caribbean global tendrils that reach to Scotland and New Zealand and probably to Mars. But what I love, one of the things I love about No Ruined Stone is that we have the experience of Burns striking out and trying to make his fortune, trying to assess his worth as a man in better terms than he has done up until that point. Like going to Jamaica with these very kind of romantic ideas of what it might mean. But then, you know, once he gets there, there is this tremendous reckoning that you have the poems kind of served to him, and he realizes both swiftly and over time that he is no match for this place. He completely underestimated what it would be like to be here.
Right.
And to be in the cradle of slavery, in a place where slavery was at its most brutal and mercenary. And he is quickly subsumed and found wanting by the very landscape that he's in. So I thought we could talk about that, how this is a pattern in literature of the Caribbean and in life, that the one who often comes to do the colonizing is themselves irrevocably changed in ways that they don't expect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it so beautifully, and I appreciate that, again, reading of his character, because, you know, I really invested myself in imagining my way into his eye, his first person, the eyes I would have to look out at to speak through his voice. And it was very difficult. The fact of this book is that I thought I would write a book entirely about the milieu of Burns in Jamaica, not just him speaking, but Nancy, other characters. And actually, the first voice I heard was Isabella's. And I began to realize that his was going to be the harder one for me to access, but felt equally necessary to grapple with all of those failures. Yeah, he is completely undone by his big mistake, if you will. You know, I chose to put him on a path that fate denied for him. He came so close to going. And as a writer, I began to feel enormously sad by what I had done to him, basically. I began to realize I put him in the worst of circumstances. He was never going to get out of there. He was going to be ruined by it, because every single history I read, one way or another, the colonizer is ruined by what they do. So if they don't die into, and this is not to say, of course, enslaved Africans are not also and horribly ruined, but people understand that part, as you pointed to. What seems to not be understood is what the ruin does to the person who becomes the colonizer, because Douglas is an example of that too. You know, he's the most corroded. His soul is the most corroded by what he becomes. And so to write from their perspective, Shivani, was like an incredibly painful and challenging experience for me. So the history helped, feeling girded by that, knowing that I wasn't doing something that wouldn't have likely happened to him. I read his poems and his songs and his journals relentlessly until I felt as if I couldn't tell where my syntax ended anymore and Burns's began. Then I felt I was now writing something that was different. And I talked to you about this at the beginning when we were chatting with Alana Marie and with Stefan. The playlist that I put together for this book, I used those songs by men. Some of them terribly ironic, like Bob Marley's "Running Away," that I listened to over and over again. And I think, again, to just kind of mire myself more in the personal stuff here, my father was a singer and songwriter. He had schizophrenia, committed suicide, and died in his early 30s, right? So when I was writing Burns in a way, I was thinking about what is the transcendence and the destruction of the male genius. You know, you and I are never going to be a genius, right? And that is because, and I don't mean that sincerely, I mean that sarcastically, that is because the imagination of art does not admit women into its categories of genius, right? Art demands that it be a male over and over again, and Burns falls into that. And I wanted to be able to understand and inhabit what that is for the person who labors under that, because it is not something I labor under the weight of. I may labor under other things, but not that. And so it really helped to think about my father and what that did to him when he was not successful, what part that played in his life, to try to get at the damage that Burns is experiencing because of his wild and reckless idealism about who he can be, despite the circumstances that should have told him otherwise, right? Anyway, I'm sort of, again, giving long answers that are very windy, so I'm going to shut up and let you ask another question.
I will never complain about the winding elegance and thoughtfulness of these answers, Shara. And really, you know, spending time with No Ruined Stone and seeing how it really, really shakes down the family tree. I mean, there's a family, you could say, at the heart of the book. There's Burns and the woman whom one could say loves, and the child that they create, who then has a child, and then that child's narrative. But it gave me incredible pause the more I thought of this unit that's presented in the poems as a family. And the question I kept asking myself was, can a family be called a family when so much of it is rooted in violent non-consent and in rape and in human indignity? What does that do to the family unit? And the book is like this perfect microcosm of what happened so unerringly during slavery, the families that were created because of the sexual excesses and lusts of white colonial men. And in a way, I think your poems are making space for that, but also, and maybe more importantly, what do the children of those ill-fated unions, how they signify themselves in the world. And then I wondered, of course, if we could talk about Isabella, whose voice is so undeniable in its need to find out who she is and how she stands on the earth.
Right. So I want to say that to begin with. Yes, I and the playlist is me also not just putting forth the songs, but reckoning with some of these questions for myself. I don't know that I came to a good answer to the question of can love exist when it is coincidental with lack of consent. I did not come to a good answer. What I did was dramatize different perspectives that ask that question rather than try to definitively answer it. I also recognize this is really tricky. And I don't mean tricky only in terms of like politically, but it is that too. I mean it in terms of the slipperiness with which when you speak of love, what do we mean? And I drew on every resource I had to try to construct Isabella's longing to be able to answer that question for herself. Burns believes that he loves Nancy. What his love for her means, that's what Isabella has to contend with. Isabella does not think that her father, she does not mince words about her father having raped her mother. So she does not mistake that overt act of violence and aggression. Well, what do you do when it is something that is in a grayer area that we continue to exist in today, in terms of relationships that labor under trying to find egalitarian relationships inside of the family unit, Shivani, or inside of the house, when the world outside of the house is inequitable still. So it's tempting to only put this into slavery and colonization and say this has nothing to do with the present, but I don't look at the present and not see that these questions continue to be problematic for us to answer, right? And particularly as a straight woman who is implicated in patriarchy and yet has this relationship, and I'm speaking Shara here, with my husband, but the world is not a non-patriarchal world. So it's a more dramatic, of course, within the context of slavery, and I'm attendant to that, I hope, that I'm not trying to undo the violence of it or try to make it some kind of beautified love story. But in a way, I'm also asking that we grapple with the possibility of love and what does that mean? And not for all the characters again, but specifically really for Isabella and her husband, right? He is, of the men we meet in the book, the most evolved in some ways, right? He's a 19th century man now, and he's a white Scotsman, and he thinks he's evolved. He is an abolitionist, but he doesn't know he's married to a Black woman. And Isabella is deathly afraid of what will be the consequence to her of testing their love. What does love mean is one of the questions that she is grappling with, as both the inheritor of destructive forms that cannot be called love, of violence, i.e. rape, and she is the product of that rape, as well as looking for some other examples. In a way, she's interrogating Burns so often because she wants to see some male figure in her family who could possibly be decent. Some parts of him she's hoping is decent. And I don't think she ultimately, I'm giving away, I suppose, what Isabella comes to conclude. But this is the question that's haunting her, is what did his quote love, that he believed he loved Nancy, what exactly did that mean for Nancy? What did that mean for her? And, what does it mean for Isabella to be the product of rape and she has to hide all of her history and be no one? In that context in which clan is everything, she is no one, and so, okay, I guess I'll just say I have more questions than answers still, but I wanted to put in action those different struggles for the women in particular who are the recipient of these systems that we continue to live inside of, in my view.
I think this is a powerful provocation and testament to what the book does, in that if you come to the end of No Ruined Stone thinking that all of the questions are answered neatly and tidily, and you're going to find out what happens to Robert Burns in this erstwhile Jamaica, then this is probably not the book for you. But if on the other hand, you're deeply invested, like you just said about the ways in which poems, Caribbean poems, move between what is historically unforgettable and what is happening to us as Caribbean people right now, then you will get exactly that. And there is that deep sense of striving towards an answer that Isabella does in very different ways to her grandfather before her, and also coming to no real fixed place. And I thought, in line with that, we could talk a little bit about passingness and how important that is to her. And it's not as though I never got the sense that she felt particularly grateful for it, in that it worked and it was important that it worked in the context that she was. But it never seemed like a blessing in her life. And you have the poem in which we like really brilliantly and cuttingly hear from someone regarding her in her new situation, and of course blaming or ascribing her complexion to the heat of the tropics.
Right.
And we know from the world being what it is that the issue of passing or not passing has not gone away with history, and this is very much something that people contend with every day, for ill or for good, or usually somewhere in the murky in between.
So again, I think that's the other question. There are many questions that this book is asking, and that Isabella in particular is vocalizing, and Burns too. He is himself trying to be a good person, almost to the bitter end, even though he's recognizing the impossibility of that, or what even that means. What is good when you've done what you've done, basically. And but Isabella is asking a similar question, believe it or not, in my mind, which is, what are the ethical costs of passing? What are the psychic costs of passing to the person who passes? And in this sense, Isabella is drawn entirely from my experiences as somebody who walks through the world, often being read as white and not identifying as white. And what does that mean? And in a Caribbean context, how that shapeshifts. In Scotland, how that is different. In America, how that is different. And because I have that experience from a different century where it is still pained in the late 20th century into which I'm born, Shivani, it was not very difficult for me to think, what would be the psychic cost to Isabella to doing this? You're right. Her whole life, her and her grandmother have enabled her to escape, to survive. This institution of slavery is degrading to everyone imbricated, and if she had stayed in Jamaica and her grandmother had not facilitated their escape, her life conditions would have been more similar to her mother's, for example. She would have been raped. She is not outright raped. She's married in the book, right? So there's just even that in terms of thinking about what would have been accessible for a Black woman in the 19th century. This is a life she can only live because people think she is white. So there's a tangible benefit. Isabella is haunted by the other part of passing narratives that we fail to discuss, I think, which is what is the cost to the person who passes? And that is what was interesting to me to explore in this book. And there is a tangible cost to her to be found out. And that's the other part of it, that we tend to want to talk only about privilege as if it is totalitizing in all contexts. But the thing is that it depends on how it moves in your life, whether or not passing is always a privilege. And I think that that's what Isabella's story is trying to get at is it a privilege to never be seen? Is it a privilege to live your whole life as a lie? What is the cost to the person who passes, really? And especially in the 19th century, again, we're talking about the 19th century. If Isabella is found out, there's no guarantee her husband is going to be okay with this, or that his family is going to be okay with this. It's not. So I think those are some things that I wanted to put out there. And I also had a just real irritation with the way that mulattoes are often presented in literature, quite frankly. And I thought, yeah, most of the time it's this sentimental 19th century trope to just be like a kind of vehicle for the author's abolitionist impulses. And I did not want her to do that. I did not. Isabella is not an abolitionist in this book. She's not, she is familiar with the movement in Scotland, and she's thinking about what does that mean, but she's an individual who's frightened and who is bereft. So that's her story.
It's impossible to think of the lives of these women, each of them, without considering the risk that they're perpetually under and how that risk looks and how it moves through their lives in very different ways, and how with something as unfathomable but also real and tangible as rape, even if one is not themselves violated personally, how the stain of that assault manifests and lives through the bloodline, so that you are never not aware of the cost that was paid, even if you yourself are not paying it, even as Isabella is herself paying all other kinds of costs in this place that is both hers, because she could certainly claim Scotland as her legacy, and both not hers. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Douglas, who the poem that you give us in No Ruined Stone, that is very identifiably told in his voice, was for me one of the hardest and also the most illuminating to read, because on the one hand, his voice doesn't sound like anything other than the truth, but at the same time, and as you alluded to, I did keep thinking what it felt like to embody someone who was so supremely confident of the inferiority of Black people, of the ways in which Black women should be used sexually, and of their own divine rights. And we know that the divine rights is a huge part of what enabled and ennobled colonizers to take what they would. And I think for all that, one of the amazing things that you do is also work very hard to show the master's humanity and the ways in which he himself is also fallible and does fail.
Yeah, so Douglas was the hardest character. Hands down, that monologue was the most difficult to write, and yet it felt essential. So the question would be, I mean, you haven't asked this, but why write it at all? Why do some of these things that I've done in this book that are kind of violence the book is performing? I thought that it couldn't be honest without it. I thought that I had to go to that length to say, what happens when an individual believes this? It's one thing for Burns for us to have some sympathy for him. There's an ironic distance from Burns that I hope is palpable, especially by the time you get to Isabella's section, right? So you're not allowed to, I hope, only have sympathy for Burns. You have to also look critically at him at the same time. But he is a figure worthy of some sympathy all the same, I would say. Harder to say that for somebody like Douglas. So the more essential for me to try to write inside of that perspective and understand, where is there any thread of humanity to this? How does an individual get to this point? And I think it's out of necessity, is what I've come down to with Douglas. How otherwise can you live if you believe if you don't believe what he believes, right? How do you live with your actions and think of yourself as a tolerable human being? I'd also layer something else into Douglas's character, which you mentioned, of course, the history of men and divine rights, and thinking that women's bodies, and Black women's bodies in particular, are there for the taking. I'd also say capitalism. I'd say that the most grotesque example of capitalism has to be slavery. The idea that humans are reduced to property. And so what would allow you to do that? You have to have then the belief in this larger system, whether that system is your corrupted version of Christianity that says white people are, Ham and Shem and Japhet are there to be subjugated by you. This is your reading of it. You have to either have that structure in place to believe that you are an okay person, basically. You have to have something like capitalism in place that tells you that human beings can be reduced to commodities, and that this is acceptable. So I had to think about Douglas in those terms to be able to engage with him at all, Shivani, because I found him to be despicable. I had acted when I was in high school, and I remembered that feeling of playing a character once who was a child who was a serial killer, and what it felt like to try to reach that person. For me, as the person, as the body to deliver that, because these are monologues, it was very similar feeling for me. Like, I have to write like I think this. So what is going to enable me to do that? And maybe somebody else says you don't have to do that, but I couldn't see how the book could be trying to get at some of the questions it's trying to get at without Douglas having that kind of viewpoint in the book itself.
Structurally, as well as emotionally. I mean, the emotional effect is palpable, but also where you place it in the narrative of the book is so visceral, because up to that point, we've had Burns really agonizing within himself about what, am I a good man? Am I being useful in this place that is ultimately defeating me? How can I justify this romantic longing that I have for this woman who I know I'm superior to? How can I be responsible in these circumstances? Can I? And then you have Douglas, whose response to that is, well, you are weak and womanish, and actually very dishonest with yourself, because you know that this is what we are here for, and this is what you do, and this is what is done to people who are not people. And in that one poem, you give us this agonizingly fully formed person who feels like a whole really frightening man. I mean, he is disgusting, but he's also like, the power of that poem is that he scares me, and that I know that there are men just like that in 2021 clothing.
Of course, right. And I think that was, and I am grateful for you for saying that, because that was for me the thing I felt I had to do. I had to make it very clear that this was the whole of this person's belief being filtered into this monologue that he's directed at Burns, that you had to get all of those viewpoints and, and know why he has come to this position that he has come to in one monologue, because I wasn't going to let him keep speaking. And so, but he breaks Burns, and that was why that monologue is there. The two things that destroy Burns is recognizing that he is powerless himself to save Nancy and Agnes, his daughter, and Isabella's mother. And that is a sign of Burns's humanity. And that comes out of the historical Burns, who did try to support. He had a lot of baby mothers, as we would say, and he didn't marry many of them. And he was a philanderer, but he tried to support them. He financially tried to support them. So I was trying to hew to what is the core of this person who's trying, even in the 18th century, that is not a common thing for a man to be doing, In the 21st century, it is not a common thing, guys. So I had to give him some credit that he was in life the figure I was, building off of the fictive Burns, somebody who wanted to be good. He wanted to be good. But Douglas is like, you're basically deluded. You have no idea what you're up against. I mean, the end of the poem says, you can't even buy yourself out of this place, which is the honest truth. The Scotsman from the position Burns was in, who went very stupidly, thinking they were going to get their fortune and come back out and have some kind of an adventure, I don't know what their thinking was. They were stuck there. They could not get back out. And so that's all, again, the history that I was trying to so much get into character studies, as opposed to a historical, treatise on this. But Douglas is a complex person, because you're meant, I hope, to see even some of our own culpabilities in the present in Douglas. So.
Yeah, I think at this point, because I could continue to happily ask you a million questions, but I think we'd love to hear from you again with your second reading, please.
Okay, so I'm going to read two poems that are toward the end of the book now, and I will just say, Isabella does grapple with, we were talking about passing, Shivani, Whether or not to continue to pass is one of Isabella's great questions that she tries to come to terms with and answer by the end of the book. And this is the voice, this is the counter to Douglas. This is the voice of her grandmother, who is dead and who speaks to her still in dreams. And so that's the title of this poem, and this is Miss Nancy's monologue. At the hour of Duppy and dream, Miss Nancy speaks. You think what lies before you asks more than you can bear. But I am with you now, as I was when you came into this world. Your one eye looking forward, the other forever looking back. From the netherworld, you were flung into this one, squalling, full of that scent we could not wash away. Your mother's breath extinguished as you gulped your first, the call swaddling your face, till we lifted it, unveiling, beholding the unasked for. Girl child cast down in a place of stone, of men who cannot see to see, do not hear what needs listening. Men who have riven borders and nations, and you, in whom the rift has opened. Hear me, for I was there in the beginning. Witness as you entered, as you came dusking, tearing all asunder, rending the fabric they call truth. And then this is the last No Ruined Stone I'll read, which is for my grandmother. And this one is just straight up in my voice at the very end of the book. When the dead return, they will come to you in dream, and in waking will be the bird knocking, knocking against glass, seeking a way in, will masquerade as the wind, its voice made audible by the tongues of leaves, greedily lapping as the wave's self-made fugue is a turning and returning. The dead will not then, nor ever again, desert you. Their unrest will be the coat cloaking you. The farther you journey from them, the more distance will maw in you. Time and place gulching when the dead return to demand accounting. Wanting and wanting and wanting everything you have to give, and nothing will quench or unhunger them as they take all you make as offering, then tell you to begin again. Thanks for listening to those.
It's not every book, I think, that can tell you at the end, listen, essentially what you have to do is start over, to which you can feel profoundly grateful for that. But that's exactly what happened with my reading of this book. I thought, of course, there's maybe no escaping the cycles, karmically existential, to which we are born. Who can say for sure? And so much of literature is devoted to trying to answer that question. But I think what that final poem is strongly hoping towards or making space for is that if you can't escape the cycles, you can always start them better than they were started by other people, in your genealogy, in your history, in the history outside of you that affected you. And that is a very powerful gesture away from desperation, away from hopelessness, away from the idea that, as Caribbean people, as Caribbean women writers, what comes before us is so heavily prescriptive and we can never evade that. And the book is so beautifully dedicated to your foremothers and your daughters. And it made me wonder what it felt like to be on the journey of the writing, which must have been both traumatic and cathartic. Did things feel different? Did burns feel different? Did the entire project of the book and its effect on you feel like there's an evolution, a shift in your thinking or in your heart when it was all done and put on the page?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. I think the truth is that as I said, I really didn't want to write this book. And so I think most of my experience was trying to figure out how I was going to bear the subject of the book that I was really afraid of, and the subjects of the book, the ones we've been talking about this whole time. I maybe seem like I figured it out now, but at the time I thought, why are you going to do this? I kept just asking myself, like, why, I was going to say, why the Ras? Why in God's name did you decide to write this book? I asked myself that many times because it was very difficult, taxing emotionally and otherwise, to try to figure it out. And I wanted to go beyond what I think has to just be understood as the premise for the book at the start, which is that slavery and rape are terrible. They're violences that are horrific, that have echoes and repetitions and ramifications way beyond the time of their action, whatever that triggering moment is. I thought that was understood. So I wanted to proceed with that as the understanding, to see where else can I go then from there. If that is what I understand and that's what I've inherited, how do I create a different arc than just saying that only? And I do think that drama and narrative were my answers, and re-inhabiting these characters from history was the answer I found. So it was a formal one for me, Shivani, that, like, I don't know that I can answer some of these questions in a definitive way, but I do think that the form allows us to repeat. And I love what you said about when we repeat it, we add something to the story, and maybe there's a little bit more insight now. You know, I don't have enough hubris to believe that I think that I don't have my blindnesses too. I'm a student of history. And so every generation thinks that they're perfected, apparently. And the truth is that we're not. And so all I can do is try to be as honest as I can, as looking at the things that terrify me and that are difficult, and see what I can do to speak to them in some way, and to not have particularly the silences persist.
You know, when I think of the relationship between Mad Woman, which is a book that I adore, and which many of you Bios and Bookmarks family may know as, of course, our 2018 OCM Bocas Prize winner for poetry. And Mad Woman was making this really terrifyingly profound case for what makes a woman unhinged in a world that is so bent on destroying her. And also, how does the Mad Woman own her madness? And in No Ruined Stone, we have the factor of three women who could conceivably have gone mad because of what they're put through. And yet their agency just shines off of the page from what we hear from them and what is said about them, both by them speaking of themselves and the men who treat them abominably or try to treat them better, but maybe not as well as they deserve. And it's a very powerful thing for those of you who are here to hear Shara read and discuss just this book. I would strongly encourage you to read her entire backlist, because the synapses you're going to get among all 6 books is something very special that I think only she can do.
You're very generous, Shivani. Thank you for that. I think each of us, and you know this too, and everyone knows Shivani's amazing book. Everyone knows I'm a Haunting. Is it everyone or everybody? I always forget.
Everyone.
It's everyone. I said it right the first time. Good. I love that book, and I love the idea too that we're both interested in investigating badness, violence, rape, gender, sexuality, and in the Caribbean context and in the context of myth and history. So I feel such kinship with your work and this conversation in general. But I will just say that we are writers, so you know you're always trying to write ahead of your own understanding. So everything I'm saying today, and it's elicited by you and your amazing questions and contextualizing of the book, it's after the fact of having written. So when I'm writing, it's more of it's like a feeling through the material in a way. And it's not to say that I don't have all of the research that I did for this book was pretty extraordinary in terms of more than other books I've written. The kind of craft that we have, the forms that we have some, facility with to help us get through. But ultimately, you don't know how it's going to ever come out, And so I had to have faith, and I had to just do something. And I don't know why I have to do that. I don't have to, I suppose, but I did. I just feel each book needs to challenge me to do something somewhat different. Or why bother? Because I'm just interested in two things anyway. I don't have anything else. So if I don't have, I really just keep feeling like, oh, I thought I was not writing the same book again. And yet apparently the more we talk, you're right. There is a kind of fixation in my mind that I keep coming back to the same threads over and over again. So knowing that about myself as a writer makes it all the more urgent for me to figure out other ways to stretch myself. And this was a stretch to write a novel in verse too. I mean, I spent all of my life as a writer being like, I love novels, but who cares what happens next? I don't have to worry about that. I'm a poet, And then I was like, oh no, now I have to know exactly what happens next and when it happens. And, trying to see my way to that was so daunting as somebody who's never written a novel, So it's good to have community. Continually to hold is good as a writer, I think.
That's so true. We have a lovely comment from, of course, someone we know very well, Mr. John Robert Lee, who says, trying to write ahead of your own understanding. Yes, Ms. Shara.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. It's so great to see your name and little tiny icon in the chat. And everybody who's here.
We can't let Shara leave without playing Promptly Written, which is a game you were introduced to Bios and Bookmarks family in our first episode last week with Rajiv Mohabir, which you can still see, of course, on Facebook. Promptly Written works like this. The writer, in this case Shara today, gets into an elevator. On that elevator are her dream publisher and editor. And they're talking about a topic, and Shara has to pitch them her dream project on that topic. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be any creative endeavor that she needs to have made, and these two people in the elevator can help her make it. And as you know, we create all our prompts specifically for our writers. Shara's prompt today is, don't you know who frightened? Shara, take it away. What's your pitch?
So as Shivani knows, this is the part of the hour that's the most daunting and that I've given the least thought to. But I'm going to just go for something since this is, since you're in Trinidad, I don't think really big. I would like to have a play. I always think of Carnival as a play. And I want a play to respond to this. And I would love to have it be, maybe it's because my daughter's reading Macbeth right now. I want all of the characters in the play to be people who are haunting the central figure. And so, and I don't know yet exactly who is going to produce this. Maybe it could be a musical, but it needs to be really clear that there is a lack of division between the world of the dead and of the living. I'm really fascinated by that in-between space. And so that's the first thing, is that it needs to be a play, needs to have an element of the spectacular, and only plays, I think, really reach that level of spectacle and spectacular. And where should it be? I would like it to be, even though I'm Jamaican, I'm going to go ahead and say I think it should be performed in Trinidad. And I would like it to be there because that's where my grandmother is from. And because even though it could easily be in Jamaica too, and plays can move around, it seems to me like the space of Carnival that Trinidad has created really honors that intersection of play and of spectacle, and also of the kind of combination of myth and what's real and what's not real. And I don't know, I'm thinking maybe of Walcott's play too, Dream on Monkey Mountain, which was so influential for me as a young writer, that I love this idea that this would be it. And I'm just going to go continually off the cuff and say I want it to be all women. I've decided as we're speaking, all women from the Caribbean. And there is a way in which I think this could work with the woman on stage being like a one-woman show, where all of these different figures who are haunting her. So like Nanny of the Maroons or like the Sukuyan. It doesn't have to be that they're real, like, because I think some of the people that we're most haunted by are those who are the figures of myth that are as real for us as any living person we've ever known. And so all dead. I love the dead. I'm constantly talking to the dead. So the central character is talking to the dead. And that phrase is a really interesting one to choose too, Shivani, because Duppy know who to frighten often means the opposite. It means that the person is saying, you are really big and ballsy, that Duppy wouldn't frighten you. Or, that it can be used to mean, of course, like, we only test those who we know can be tested. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that my one woman in the center of this stage with all these figures coming in, she is not frightened of them at all. Yeah.
I immediately would like to go and see this play tomorrow.
Let's make it happen. Let's do it. Now that I have given the pitch.
I think we need
how
to.
do we do it?
We need to. So the dream editor and in this case filmmaker, if you're watching somewhere in the world,
contact
has to happen. Shara, I want to thank you so much for being with us in this hour of bios and bookmarks. It's been beyond a privilege and an honor and a joy to speak with you about this extraordinary book, which everyone must go and read immediately. You can get the book directly from its publishers, Peepal Tree Press and Alice James Books, depending on if you're in the US or the UK. And thank you so much for your insight and your generosity and sharing all of that with us today.
Thank you, Shivani, and thanks everyone who's here and listening.
This has been Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. And if you love what the Bocas Lit Fest family does, please check out Friends of Bocas Lit Fest, which we'll see just a bit about in a minute. We would love to have you join us on our journey as we proceed in the next 10 years and beyond. Of course, Bios and Bookmarks will be back same time next week. Until then, everyone, take care of yourselves and be safe. Thank you.